All right, for learning objective 2, we're going to discuss Hamilton's report on public credit. So the first task of the first administration of the second U.S. federal government's constitution, the constitution that we have now that replaced the Articles of Confederation, they needed to deal with the collapsing economy of the 1780s. This is what is being inherited in the 1790s. So the revolution disrupted the economy greatly. Britain had stopped buying American-made goods. The revolution put the states in a great deal of debt. People, frankly, just didn't see improvements they expected after the war and were beginning to lose faith in the entire process. And people that loaned money during the war were not being paid back and were losing money on those investments. All right, and so to deal with all of this, in 1789, Hamilton was asked to solve the debt crisis. It took him a couple of years. He came up with 3 different reports. The 3 reports included one on public credit, which is what we're looking at in this learning objective. The other one was in the National Bank, which is what we're going to look at learning objective 3. And the one we're not going to look at is manufacturing and trade guidelines. Dealing with public credit, funding. The issues of funding a new federal government for basic infrastructure, for commercial development, and for the day-to-day operations of government. Hamilton believed strongly that the federal government needed to be funded, and this depended highly on future credit, and how we were going to get future credit was dealing with the present-day debt that Hamilton was faced with and trying to solve. All right, so there was a foreign debt of $11.7 million for the war, and the question was, should that be paid? According to Hamilton, absolutely. So in his report, he basically ties the future survival of the United States and the immediate survival to the United States on public credit. So to quote him, was the price of liberty. Public credit was the price of liberty. Debt was the price of liberty. He goes on, the faith of America has been repeatedly pledged for it. Among ourselves, the most enlightened friends of good government are those whose expectations of prompt payment are the highest, to justify and preserve their confidence, to answer the calls of justice, to restore landed property to its due value, to furnish new resources, both to agricultural and commerce, to cement more closely the union of the states, to add to their security against all foreign attacks, to establish public order on the basis of an upright and liberal policy. These are the great and invaluable ends to be secured by a proper and adequate provision at the present period for the support of public credit. So this is a must. If we want to protect ourselves, if we want future business, if we want agriculture to thrive, whatever the case may be, without public credit, we are sunk. Now, everyone agreed to the foreign debt of $11.17 million, owed mostly to the Netherlands, Spain, and France, should be paid at face value. Consequently, almost overnight, Hamilton's fiscal feat had established the public credit. As a result, the Treasury was able to secure needed funds in the Netherlands on terms more favorable than any other borrowing nation. So right from the get-go, Hamilton is establishing his plans as successful. Where things got a little dicey with him is there were many people that objected to paying the $42.4 million at par, which the government borrowed under the Articles of Confederation from the American people during the war. So in other words, the domestic tax, not the foreign tax, but the domestic tax. So the opposition was led by people like Jefferson and Madison, who were upset, who were concerned when urban speculators rushed to rural areas where they purchased loan certificates from unsuspecting citizens at bargain prices. It was estimated that of the national domestic obligation, about 20,000 people owed a majority only 20 of whom were the original creditors. So there was a lot of speculation of these original securities. So Hamilton's program allowed all current holders of loan certificates, no matter how they attained them, to exchange the old certificates for new government bonds bearing 6% interest, right? And that's a sizable amount, especially if you have a lot invested. So Madison was concerned about citizens and soldiers who, because of financial hardship, were compelled to sell their certificates at rock bottom prices. And now that the interest rates have gone up, they felt like these people were kind of left out in the cold and taken advantage of and exploited by those of greater means. So why should wealthy expectors, Madison argued, profit now off their hardships? Also, to many backcountry farmers, making money without physical labor appeared strange. It appeared immoral. It definitely appeared un-Republican and certainly un-American. To many, records had for too many there had been records had been lost since the Revolutionary War in the Treasury Department, and beginning to identify all original holders. So it was basically unfair. You couldn't really make any claims that you once had these securities and they were basically stolen from you by some means. So Madison was worried, and Jefferson was worried about these people as well. Nevertheless, the result, by February of 1790, Congress soundly defeated Madison's proposal to pay the highest price to speculators, which has prevailed in the market, and remaining funds would go to the original purchaser. And this is what Hamilton wanted. And again, he's trying to create a favorable situation for the wealthy so that they will in turn begin to formulate a national identity. Nearly half of the members of the House of Representatives, 29 of the 64, own continental securities, many of through purchases. The debate had organized opposition between the urban commercial class and the agricultural rural class over the domestic debate began the solidification of these two interest groups that would be the formation of the two parties. Next, under his assumption program, Hamilton urged the federal government to pay all remaining state debts. So Hamilton argued that the states were a proper national obligation, for they had been incurred in the war for independence for the national interest, right? So each state contributed, yes, but it was for the national interest. Hamilton believed federal assumption of the state debts would, and this is where he was thinking in national interests, would chain the states more tightly to what he called the federal chariot. It was hoped that the maneuver would shift the attachment of wealthy creditors from the states to the federal government. Getting the wealthy, again, to think nationally was the crucial link in Hamilton's political strategy and to strengthen the central government. Hamilton also reasoned that the federal government assumption of the state's $21.5 million debt would significantly reduce the power of individual states to shape national economic policy and thus create a strong central government. And as discussed before, assumption unleashed great criticism from states like Virginia, where Jefferson and Madison were from, who were going to be his leading opponents, which had already paid its Revolutionary War debts. And Hamilton's program seemed to reward certain states like Massachusetts for failing to put their finances in order. Virginia had levied high taxes to pay its debts, and now its citizens would have to pay the debts of other states as well, mostly for the benefit of northern speculators. And so this seemed, one, unfair, and it seemed to benefit a commercial class of people who were in a position to take advantage of a rural class of people, that those in agriculture who were living year to year and were growing more and more dependent on the commercial class for loans. This is something small farmers have to do all the time. This is something large farmers have to do all the time, including Jefferson. And so he saw this as something that was going to get in the way of it. So the debate over financing in the federal government would help polarize the southern agricultural interests against that of the northern commercial interests, which would help lead to the two-party system, which we'll cover later. To win support for his controversial plan, Hamilton made a deal with the large, powerful congressional plan delegation from Virginia. He agreed to support the transfer of the national capital from Philadelphia, its temporary home, to the new federal district across the Potomac from Virginia to what would be known as Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, where it is now. All right, so this was a way of placating the concerns of Jefferson and Hamilton that they would have, by just proximity to Washington, some influence over the federal government. But let's watch a video that really depicts this debate between Hamilton and Jefferson that was originally aired on HBO's John Adams miniseries. So take a look and see what Jefferson's concerns are about Hamilton's financial plan.
You must find Philadelphia much changed, Mr. Jefferson.
More change than I could have imagined, Mr. Hamilton. Not the city itself. All cities swallow everything in their wake.
That's no surprise to me. That's why I abhor them. But I've been, as you know, in revolutionary France, where the streets are filled with the songs of liberty and brotherhood and the overthrow of ancient tyrannies of Europe, and to return from there to this, our cradle of revolution, and find the dinner table chatter is all of money and banks and authority is an unwelcome surprise.
Unwelcome, perhaps, but necessary.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as to the purpose of the Treasury Department. No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
And how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
If the states are indebted to a central authority, it increases the power of the central government.
You have it exactly. The greater the government's responsibility, the greater its authority.
The moneyed interest in this country is all in the north, so the wealth and power would inevitably be concentrated there in a federal government, to the expense of the south.
If that is the case, it is unavoidable if the Union is to be preserved.
I fear our revolution will have been in vain if a Virginia farmer is to be held in hock to a New York stock jobber, who in turn is in hock to a London banker. The opportunities for avarice and corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
Well, sadly, that is very well said. But there can be no question. Our nation cannot bind together without powerful central government. But we must also accommodate the needs of our constituent states, both North and South. The power of one must check and balance the other. And to that end, we must dedicate all of our energies and our care.